the year I returned after 16 years of being abroad, because I was trying to make sense of my own return journey. And at that time, I was struggling with reintegration because I left as a child and came back as an adult. So I had no social capital. I had no cultural heritage that I could rely on. I did not know my language. In Kenya, if you don't know, Kiswahili is a national language, then I have my ethnic language. So I didn't have any foot on the ground. So this paper that I wrote, which is about 14 years ago, was just to make sense of my return and reintegration journey. And I thought it was very great that I was invited to the GAPS conference to now talk about it. I think this is God's way of saying you needed to talk about this paper, which was not published, by the way. It was just me writing freely about my experience. So I would like to thank the GAPS team for inviting me for this conference. It has been very interesting for me, very reflective. I wish I could sit in all the panels. There were just too many to choose from. But in the end, I chose the warmest room in the conference on the first day. So what I wanted to do is touch on a few things, a few critical questions that I asked myself, but I feel like we're asking ourselves in this two-day conference. And there are three critical questions I wanted to unpack. And maybe we don't have the answers for it right now, but we do have some answers that can actually lead us to the next stage. So three of the questions I hope to answer in my keynote are: how do migrants themselves define home across borders? What roles do the formal and informal structures play in shaping the possibility of meaningful return? And how can we reshape migration policy frameworks to accommodate the fluid nature of contemporary belonging? So let me just begin with the truth that every migrant moves for a particular reason. And we leave home because we must, and we dream of return because we cannot forget. The decision to migrate is rarely made lightly. It emerges from a mix of push and pull factors that we all know: economic, political, search for education, desire for opportunity for ourselves and our children. We tell ourselves stories like, it's temporary, I'll be back, I'll be sending money to my family, it's only for a moment until things get better. These stories I have heard throughout my research experience, but also through my own as well. Now, to give you some context, I've been migrating since I was a child because of my father, who was an academic. He was going everywhere doing migration, so ironically, I had to do migration. I don't know if that's by osmosis, but in a sense, I was able to sort of like get a feel of the migration experience as a child, but as an adult as well. So my decision-making started when I was 18, and not when I was 6 months old, when that was my first migration journey, because I could not remember anything from that. The one thing that I know is that the narratives are more or less similar or the same in most contexts. It doesn't matter which country that we are going to or from. But what we do not anticipate in migration is how it fundamentally transforms us. We become people who exist in the threshold between worlds. In my case, I left pieces of myself in different countries. My childhood has been split with the vibrant streets of Nairobi and the Harmattan seasons of Accra, while my teenage experience explored the Kalahari Desert and the Okavango Delta of Botswana, and my young adulthood traversed the multicultural streets of London. So that gives you an idea of where my footprints have been since. And now I'm back to the vibrant streets of Nairobi and the chaos of the Nairobi traffic. If you know Nairobi, Nairobi is known for their traffic. To this day, I still feel home in all of these places because I left pieces of myself in these places. From what I've seen from the GAPS conference, it has addressed critical themes of return migration, and it was difficult for me to choose, as I mentioned, which sessions to attend. But from the sessions, I could get a sense return migrants wrestle with profound questions of when, where, what, and who. So when should I return? Do I have to wait until I've made it? Or until my children have finished school? Until the political situation has improved? The timing is never quite right, because you can want to move today and then things change within a hot second. Where exactly is home, and will I feel like I belong? Is it where I come from, my parents, where they come from in a village in Kisumu by Lake Victoria? Is it the city I studied in? Is it the country where my family has grown up in? Home becomes plural, contested, and fragmented. What will I do when I return? And will I find my community? I have international qualifications and experience. Will I be able to adapt to my community because I'm no longer the person I was? I've become something else. And who will I become when I return? Will I become the daughter returning with my PhD with valuable knowledge and experience? Or will I be viewed suspiciously that I left and was not sitting behind to fight the cause? These are questions all return migrants grapple with when they are considering return, and others. These are just some of them. And it's a conversation return migrants must have regardless at some point in their life. So the second question, the first question actually I want to unpack was, how do migrants themselves define home across borders? In my lived experience, I discovered that as a migrant, I am transnational in my experience, where home has become a mix of places, relationships, and practices across multiple nations and cultures. Consider the return of a migrant who maintains a house in their country of origin. So in my case, it would be Nairobi. But then I have an apartment in London, just in case. You never know what will happen, just in case. I celebrate Christmas with my family in my village, but then I go on holiday in France or Italy. So the interpretations are they vary. But at the same time, we need to realize that return migrants are always feeling displaced. They never quite feel at home, never fitting anywhere. And that we've been able to see from the interpretations that we've heard today and yesterday. They also feel culturally disconnected, either viewed too American, too British, too French, or too African when you're in your country, or too Latin American or Asian in the country where you're resident. So what is your identity at that point? They're also temporarily suspended, often living in the past when remembering home, living in an imagined future when planning return. And they're also fractured relationally, in the sense that they do not connect with their childhood friends, their childhood community, who cannot relate with the international experiences that they have had so far. I can definitely attest to all these feelings because I grappled with this for the first 5 years of return. In my head, I was still going back to London. In my head, I was still trying to reconnect with where I just left. Home for the return migrant becomes less about geography, but it's about a negotiation, a daily practice of creating belonging in spaces that are familiar yet foreign. And often the decision to return becomes at a stepwise negotiated process, meaning I need to test the ground. I need to first try, see what are my opportunities, identify my social capital, identify where I want to live, basically recreating what I have in the country of residence, in my country of origin again. So I'm negotiating a stepwise return experience, which is something that I feel we rarely see in our research, but it's something that is a reality. This brings me to the second question about the roles that formal and informal structures play in shaping the possibility of meaningful return. In this conference, I found myself attracted to the panels on infrastructure because I wanted to understand the different infrastructures in different regions, to understand, are we all having a similar infrastructure, or is it changing, or what can I use to reflect on when I'm working with policymakers on a type of infrastructure that can work, that is comprehensive. And we saw from the research presented at this conference, it has illustrated that return is not merely an individual decision, but it's shaped by institutional frameworks that create the infrastructure of return. From the sessions I attended, there are different types of infrastructure in place to manage and coordinate migration. Specifically, on the formal side, you find states trying to approach return through multiple and sometimes contradictory lenses, either adopting a security-driven approach, so that frames return as border control and deportation management. We've also heard about the reintegration assistance programs that are often fragmented with limited funding and fundamental understanding of what returnees actually want and need. Providing someone with a small business grant does not address the stigma that they face as a deportee, or the psychosocial challenges that they face when they return to their community. The most common that I've seen, especially in Africa, is the development-oriented approaches. These celebrate diaspora engagement and attempt to harness brain gain, which we have seen through these policies that are in place through tax incentives, skills matching programs for the returnees, but highly skilled returnees. We don't see for those returnees who have skills that support other sectors. They seek to manage flows, not to nurture belonging in this case. Return migrants also experience bureaucratic challenges, barriers, as we heard. And the return makes it very difficult for them and problematic. Things like paperwork, documentation, meeting the requirements, and in some cases, some of them are forced to actually, or coerced into returning, becomes problematic in that sense. And these are things that governments that are countries of origin that need to receive them have to have the conversation and put mechanisms in place that facilitate the return process for all of their citizens abroad. When we look at the informal infrastructure, these are equally powerful, but we don't really see them being discussed in more detail. And these are invisible to policymakers because they look into family expectations. So looking at what family expects you to come back with. You need to build a house, you need to create jobs for your family, you need to be able to give something tangible that says you have made it. So the pressure to perform when struggling is very immense for returnees, all returnees, whether it's someone who is struggling on a job or someone who's actually doing well, there's still that pressure to give back to the home, especially for mental health. And also the way the community receives you varies. We have heard in this conference that the stigma returnees face in their community, especially those who've been deported with no psychosocial support to address the shock of return, and the rejection from family and community. I recall when I returned, there was a guy who was driving me to the airport, and he basically asked me if I was deported, because no one voluntarily returns. So this is a question of why did you come back? And it's a question I still get today, why did you come back? So it means that when you come back, you have failed because you've not been able to establish one citizenship in that country, or you've not been able to show that you have footprints and diversity of your heritage. You can be American and Kenyan. So it's almost like I failed for them because I came back with just my PhD certificate, and that wasn't enough. So that already tells you the implications that communities have on returnees, that you need to come back with something that is valuable to them, not to you. So I've always spent years explaining why I came back, and these days I just don't. I just show them my several passports that allows me to travel the world a bit. But it's just that aspect of them recognizing that return does not have to have an economic attachment to it. It can be more than that. But we've also heard in this conference that returnee migrants who are deported or forced to self-deport when they are not ready also experience stigma and discrimination, social exclusion, and they get questions of why did you come back? Almost like a betrayal of the family member. So how do we handle, how do we support them, or how do we encourage government to put mechanisms in place to support them when they return? Because they, regardless of the situation, they are still citizens of the country and they need the support from the government. Another aspect that I wish I could have attended, but it's something that I highlighted or I could see, is the gender dynamics. So it adds another layer of complexity where women who return and face intensified patriarchal expectations, or they're expected to go back to what they used to do in their community or their ethnic group. Women who have lived abroad are seen to be too independent, too vocal, and it's that aspect of you're not willing to go back to the way things are. In my case, I was asked, why didn't I come back with a husband? So I don't know what it has to do with that, but it's one of those aspects of there's an expectation that you have to come back with a foreign husband that makes it seem like you've achieved something that is of value to the community. But they wouldn't do the same for my brothers. They wouldn't do that. But they do that for women because that's what we saw as a pattern for so many years, that it's indoctrinated in our heads that when you come back with something of value that the community will accept. So the infrastructure of return has yet to balance both the formal and informal, and you can see it in the policies and the frameworks in place for those countries that have them, especially if you want to have meaningful reintegration. So in my opinion, diaspora policies now from the side of the country of origin are still in different phases of iterations. They have to go through the first phase of attracting what they want at that point in time, but they have to include other returnees. because other returnees will come with skills that are of value to different sectors, and they need to be able to give people choices of how they can always come back. Even if they're being deported, they need to come back with dignity at that point. So this brings me to the third point, which is how can we reshape migration policy frameworks to accommodate the fluid nature of contemporary belonging. The current paradigm treats migration as a linear journey. So you go from origin to destination and possible return. But in the case of most African countries, or actually most African countries, let me talk about that because that's what I know, it's more of sending our migrants abroad for opportunities but not facilitating return. And this is a conversation I've been having with the government since 2014, the first diaspora policy in Kenya, where I asked the question, if I'm a student returning, what is my pathway for return? And they did not, and still do not, have an answer to that question. So it means that they're targeting high value, highly skilled migrants to come back, to give back to the community, but not those who have acquired the skills that can actually develop some of the sectors in the country. So that's a really important aspect that I keep on driving to go forward. But as this conference has demonstrated, contemporary migration is better understood as circular and multi-directional from the sessions I attended. People don't just return once and settle permanently. They engage in circular mobility, spending some years here, some years there, and responding to family needs or personal needs in this case, or political changes, or in this case, climatic environmental changes. So it's a way of strategically positioning yourself in terms of return migration by maintaining footholds in multiple locations to hedge against uncertainty in a very volatile and dynamic world. If we're to build migration governance systems to fit the world that we live in, we need fundamental shifts in our mindsets, but even for policymakers to be, conversant with the realities on the ground. So we need to transition from return to transitional engagement. So looking at treating return as not the end of the migration journey, but the start of recognizing a phase of ongoing transnational lives. This means we should look at portability of benefits, recognition of skills and qualifications, dual citizenship in countries that don't have them, or circular visa schemes for countries that allow legal pathways for return or circular migration. We can also consider moving from integration to recognition of plurality. Ooh, the language interference was coming in. We need to consider stopping to expect returnees to seamlessly re-assimilate into a single national culture, because even our cultures have changed over time. We need to value hybrid identities. Our identities will always be reshaped because we're in a very globalized world at the moment. So we need to be able to adopt that. We come from different, we'll experience different cultures, and we'll be able to share some of the best of the cultures that we've actually embraced in our migration journeys. So we need to create spaces for transnational communities to find their way to merge with the local communities, because sometimes we feel like there's an expectation for them to absorb themselves into the local communities, but maybe the local communities are not ready to absorb them because they're still trying to understand them. So how do we create a space for them to at least embrace each other and see what are the best they can get from each other? But we also need to combat stigma by having candid conversations with community on migration experiences. So beyond public awareness, how can we do that to allow the community that's receiving the returnees to be able to see the challenges they've gone through, but also the opportunities they're bringing to their community to build their community, and not see migration as a failed experience when you return, but as an opportunity to grow or develop your community through their resources and through their expertise. I cannot stress this enough, because it's something that I'm seeing among migrants who've experienced distress, but also migrants who've been outside for such a long time, the psychosocial aspect, because they struggle to reintegrate into a community that is not familiar to them anymore, because they're being judged, they're being seen differently. It's almost like you're going through a process of reintegrating again, but as an adult. And I think there's an aspect where we need to sort of like address the reverse culture shock you experience. In my case, it was language and culture, but I had to embrace it by being okay being teased about the wrong terminology I'm using in my language, going into places that puts me in uncomfortable situations, but being able to do that. But how many people can do that? Many people just want to go to a place where it's a community of people who come from the diaspora, from their community. So if you ever find yourself in Kenya and you find California flats, Texas flats, that's where someone has come from, and they're just trying to build their community so that they can have relatable people that do not judge where they've come from. But how can governments also move from reintegration assistance to enabling ecosystems? By moving beyond short-term project-based assistance to create systemic conditions for returnee success. Governments can also achieve this through supporting entrepreneurship schemes that join diaspora with the local community to actually support startups or SMEs, and not just a one-time grant opportunity. This allows the diaspora and the local entrepreneur to actually share their knowledge and expertise to build a particular business or build a particular product that will cater to the development of the country. But also provide skills matching schemes. So being able to show people, especially now with AI, there's opportunities where you can actually share skills and engage with the local community about how to use AI for what they're doing, or digital platforms. There are so many opportunities to do that. The government also needs to put in place community mediation programs that are built to facilitate dialogue between returnees and non-migrants, as mentioned earlier. But also there's a need for data and evidence. This, I think, is an ongoing process. It has to be something that we review, we reflect on, we see the changes, and we adapt based on the changes. We also need to consider transitioning from state-centric to human-centric. I think what I've been seeing or hearing from the conversations is a lot of state-centric agendas, and the human face is actually disappearing from that agenda. And I think we need to start shifting or trying to help shift that lens from border control, security, and development, and look at the human dignity and the rights of the migrants. So the right to return should be matched with the right to re-immigrate. Return should also be voluntary and not coerced. And the interests of the migrants should also be central to the agenda, while the returnees' voices should also be part of that conversation in designing the policies. What I see in policies is sometimes the diaspora returnees are not part of that conversation. So you cannot design a policy without including them and how it impacts them in the long run, because they're the ones who are going to test out the policy, and they're the ones who are going to say what doesn't work. And they can also choose not to engage with the policy because it doesn't reflect their interest. So I'll just talk more personally. I think I've been dropping a few personal experiences of my own. And I think I'm someone who returned only to, I am not someone who returned only to leave again, although the temptation to leave was actually there, but the option was not available to me. So in my case, I had to find a reintegration strategy that works for me that did not involve government. But through that, I'm having conversations with government that allows me to show them ideas, especially in this session, in this conference, I've been able to at least get ideas that I can share with governments on how they can develop reintegration programs that cater for all migrants who want to return by choice, or even those who are deported, how to facilitate their return and not make it a tedious process for them. For me, I think return migration, the question of East-West, is home really best, is it depends on you as a person. It can be flawed. It can assume that your home is a singular location, but it could be multiple locations in many cases. It could not be geographically fixed in one place. It also assumes that return migrants must choose. So my question to you all is, what if home is not a place that we find, but a practice that we perform? What if home is just regular phone calls with your family members, Sunday dinners with your friends and your community members, engagements with your academic communities and peers across continents? What if home is in the work that we're doing right now? Home is not something external to us that we either possess or lack. Home is an ongoing process of creating meaningful belonging in a world that demands mobility. So, back to my question again, East-West, is home truly best? This question will vary for all of us, because I think we're coming from different walks of life, and there's so many issues that are facing the world, and it's changing so much that we can't really answer this question concretely. We'll have several answers to the question. So home is best when it allows you to be fully human, in my opinion, to pursue your aspirations, to maintain your connections, to contribute your talents to what you're doing, to raise your children in a safe environment that you feel comfortable with and they also feel comfortable with, to age with dignity. Home is best when it recognizes rather than erases our complexity. Home is best when it offers belonging without demanding the abandonment of all other belongings. So the future of migration governance will not be determined by whether we build higher walls or develop stricter return policies. It will be determined by whether we have the courage and imagination to build systems that recognize mobility as a fundamental to the human condition and belonging as something we can practice across borders. So I feel like this conference has allowed us to share insights of return realities that, though they did mention initially that it's a bit pessimistic, but I always see aspects of it being a reality of what we're facing, and we just need to use that reality to improve on what's on the ground in our different respective areas. So as researchers, practitioners, migrants ourselves, we have the responsibility to find solutions, to find strategies, to make sense of this return journey, and to amplify the voices of those whose stories are often not heard of, which is something that I've been able to hear in this conference. So we need to challenge the assumptions embedded in current frameworks and imagine and build alternatives in this case. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you so much for the invitation. This has been very valuable to me, and I've made great connections in these sessions, and I'll be happy to take any questions. I think Terry is going to moderate it, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was very thought-provoking, and it covered a lot of the themes that we've been addressing here over the past 2 days. You also picked up on quite a few points that recommendations, suggestions on how return governance can be improved that we put forth in our policy brief, that is our final policy brief that is about to be released. We hope to have it ready next week. We'll be distributing it, I'm sure, to all of you who are here, and it contains some of the key points and recommendations that we've managed to come up with over the past couple of years on the basis of our extensive, 3 years on the basis of our extensive research. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, just a couple of questions before we open the floor, regarding just one kind of provocative question to begin with, and that is, if you could ask European and African policymakers to abandon one core assumption about return governance, what would it be, and what would you replace it with?
That's a very big question. I should have asked you before I gave the speech. A big assumption of return.
Yeah, basically a core assumption that seems to inform a lot of policy. When you worked around the world, you're familiar with return regimes. We've been discussing them here in different contexts, and if you've seen how it's done, how it works, what's missing. You made lots of good suggestions also in your speech just now. I'm just wondering if there's one thing you wish that people would give up in their ideas about how return migration works.
Yeah.
What would that be, and what would you like them to take on board?
I think the fact that they assume people don't want to return is a huge assumption, and I feel people still return one way or the other. I have come across migrants who will use different channels to return, go to a second country, and then go by road to come to Kenya. So the assumption that they don't want to return is something that's flawed, in the sense that many want to return and remain connected to the homeland, and they'll want to return at some point in their life. It's just when they have to do that. So I think it's just having more flexible opportunities for that circular migration or skills pathway that many countries are looking towards developing. I've not seen one that is effectively being implemented, maybe from my side, because I concentrate a lot on Africa. But I feel that if there's more flexibility, then people will go and come back more often, and they wouldn't want to stay in one place. Because one thing I've seen, I don't know whether it's because of the environment we live in, the perception is that it's much more difficult now to be a migrant, so it's much better to be at home where you feel like you belong in that sense, and you're not always negotiating belonging in a different country.
And negotiating what home is too,
Yes.
as we learned. I thought that was a very interesting idea. Okay, because I know that we've had a long day, we've had a long couple of days. I'm going to go straight to the floor, and if you could come up on stage. Unfortunately, we don't have a microphone that we can pass around here. We weren't able to organize that, but we do have this microphone on the podium. So if I could invite you to come to the stage and put your question to Linda over here. There's a little button right at the bottom of the microphone, then the red light will come on. And I know I've seen one hand go up already back there. So if I could invite you to direct your question to Linda, and I think there's another hand I saw at the front. There's not going to be any shortage of hands, I'm sure. I already see Anna down here. Great.
So I'm Jill Adams, I'm a legal anthropologist, and I just felt really struck by your question, given that I'm so low on sleep. I was compensating by raising my hand very enthusiastically, because I think it is true that in response to Linda's response, and maybe we could also open up and have a broader conversation, I think it is true that we could roughly divide migration studies and return studies into people who, like both policymakers and scholars, who either assume that migrants want to return or do not want to return. I think we all work with an assumption one way or the other. No border people will lean towards assuming that migrants do not want to return, and sort of go against the policy drive to push people to return. And then we also have the other side, that people who work more closely aligned with reintegration programs and who sort of study the efficiency, or like can we better conceptualize the outcomes of these reintegration programs, would lean towards the assumption that migrants want to return. And then of course there's a spectrum in between. But I would love to answer the question that you asked, what is the big assumption that I would like to do away with? And I have an issue with the word reintegration, because it presupposes that there was integration. And depending on what country of origin or country of nationality you're talking with, and the state of the welfare state, the state of the state, is it actually valid to work with that assumption that there was integration to start with?
Great, thank you very much. You're welcome to comment on that, or not. Would you like to?
No, I was not going to comment directly, because I think it's a good question. And I think it's sometimes we use a safe word to make sense of something. And in many countries, they use reintegration as something that works and just assumes that everybody knows what reintegration means. But even it's that aspect of maybe we should have a conversation, a deeper conversation of what that should be defined as. In my experience of working with migrants, when I ask them to explain what return or whatever it is would mean, should it be a program, like how would they define it? It's completely different. So maybe having a wider conversation of what that means to different types of migrants will help us to reach a middle ground. Otherwise we're imposing a definition on that program. But for now, when you look at even diaspora policies, they talk about reintegration programs, but they don't really unpack that very clearly. So it's still a work in progress in many countries of origin, and I think it's something that, as I said, there'll be several iterations of policies that will redefine what we're seeing as reintegration. Sometimes they don't even want to talk about readmission and all that stuff. So it's something that is a work in progress that probably more future research we need to do work on. But I would want to also hear what others have to say on this point. So it's a good question that you raised for us to think about.
I think I saw another hand here, yeah. And then Anna, we have about 10 more minutes for this session.
Yes, many thanks for your presentation. It was very rich, and thanks for sharing your personal feelings. I was wondering, because you have mentioned the question of reintegration and pluralism in this hyper identity, and I was wondering, in from your experience, your living experience, so whose responsibility is this to provide a space for the returnee to live up with this pluralism, or to keep up this hyper identity, because you have mentioned the person is not the same person anymore, the community is not the same community. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Do I answer? I think we're all low on battery, so I probably wouldn't remember all the questions. But thank you for that question. I think what I've seen in my experience is that we create those communities because we have to actually be able to converge on similar ideas, and usually that was through social media. And then there's some groups like in Kenya now, we have a much bigger group, Kenya Diaspora Alliance, that brings everyone from different countries, Kenyans from different countries, and they create that platform where they start having that community where they have shared and lived experiences. And then through that, they're building it to create investment platforms, to create community dynamics, but also to build bridges with the local community in that sense. So right now, at the moment, the responsibility is lying on the diaspora because they're making it their job to find other people with a similar background. But the government is also trying to do the same by actually creating a platform once a year for them to speak to the government about how they're engaging with their local government, but also with development initiatives. So that's one thing that has changed over the past 10 years, whereas before it was very difficult for the diaspora to do that. You just needed to know your neighbor is a diaspora, and then you just connect, have coffee, and then you build your community from there. But that's what I've seen has happened in the case of Kenya. In other countries, it could be very different, where people don't want to know you're from abroad, but they'll know from your behavior, your mannerisms. I remember people kept on saying that I keep time. Kenyans don't keep time. So it's that aspect of if you're late by 5 minutes, I'm leaving, so they knew I was not brought up in Kenya. So it's just finding your community, and for now, the government is not taking responsibility for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And then we have one more question from over here after Anna.
Okay. Terry raised the thing by asking us to come up here. So I have one more academic question, which is the life course perspective. I think return, whether constrained more or less, the time in your life makes a difference, and I think you reflected a bit on that. So if you could reflect a bit more. And about the Terry's provocative question, I think one assumption that we should do away with is that reintegration means that you're not going to leave again. And I think studies show that you can perfectly reintegrate and leave again. These are two separate things. But I think it is very different. Like, we all operate under constraints, but I think the level of your constraints make a difference in terms of returns. So GAPS was more on the coerced returns, when people don't want, but they are sent. So the question the second question for you, Linda, is like, where would you draw the line where, because as you said, like, we all operate under constraints, or there are moments in our lives that push us in one direction or another, but where would you see the voluntary starting and or the voluntary finishing and the highly constrained starting?
Okay. Thank you for those questions, Anna. I would have been surprised if you didn't ask the question. On the life course, definitely that is something that plays a role in the decision to return. I feel as if you're under 35, and maybe you don't have any commitments back home, your likelihood of returning is lower, but it could be if you have a family or children. What I've seen is that some people who have had children abroad are choosing to bring their children back when they're younger so that they integrate easily. So it also depends on the dynamics of the person. So I could be the same age as someone who has a family, and they're more likely to stay because they'll benefit more, but I'll be more likely to move if I wanted to go back because I see opportunities that favor me. But what I also see that's very common, especially amongst older migrants, is they try to find pathways for return back to their community because they want to be able to be buried in their community. but they also struggle with finding their community there because they've grown so different. So the life course is definitely something that features in the decision to migrate, return, but people don't really factor those other underlying issues that they don't think about, like I'm so different from my neighbor who has not left the village in a long while. So those are things that I think it still plays a key role in our analysis for research, and I think it's something that we always have to keep in mind, including the gender element as well. So some people would want to move, but they have the community that they live in is not open to women doing certain things or owning property, among other things. On, I think your second question was on voluntariness. Yeah. Where do you draw the line? I think that's difficult to say, especially it becomes an individual response. Like it depends on how you weigh the options available to you at that present time, and what works for you, what resources you also have available. So I think that response will depend on what your return options are. Because I know of people who cannot return back to their country but they're Cameroonian but went to South Africa because they said South Africa ticks all the right boxes. But it means that they have to also align with what the requirements in South Africa. So I think voluntariness also depends also on the conditions in the country of origin where they are resident, but also in the country of the chosen destination, which may not be their country of origin. So this is not you can't get a direct response to it. There are various responses to that. Yeah.
Thank you. And final question. Sorry.
I'll just go there. Yeah, thank you a lot for the presentation. I wanted just to touch upon one aspect, one recommendation you made.
Excuse me, if you could just identify yourself. Sorry.
I'm SNF, I'm like a legal counselor in Germany, I'm from Italy. But I wanted to touch upon the recommendation you made about moving from a state-centric to a more human-centric. And I noticed that this approach has been adopted by the state, and that a lot of like if I see, for example, in the EU, the proposed new regulation, return regulation, you find the term like humane and fundamental rights, human and fundamental rights, really, I think, everywhere in the document. And then you kind of see this kind of question of like humane interpretation, like speaking of humane forms of interpretations. And so how do we deal with that? Like, how do we deal then with the state taking on the human-centric while to legitimize also in a way inhumane.
Those are very tough questions. I guess you're not too asleep this afternoon. I think that's an important point in the sense that, yes, the state can include humane, but it's a question of whether they're actually doing it in reality. And I think we see that in some of the practices of the programs that they have, when you as a researcher are able to see inhumane practices. The problem is that we cannot do much, from my side, and I'm talking from country of origin side, is that we can acknowledge that they have actually included it in the documentation, but now we have to make sure they're accountable to that process and practice, and ensure that human rights element, the gender sensitivity, the age sensitivity is part of the practice itself. But CSOs come in there to do an assessment to find out, but we do not know the nitty-gritties when it goes down to the actual practice. So we're still excluded in that process, in the sense that we can only access the information from the migrants who return to identify those inhumane practices and then share that information to the government officials that this is an inhumane practice. But having them to respond to that is an advocacy effort that requires all the stakeholders to come together to push on that agenda. And that's what I see happens in Kenya when we see trafficking cases. We all collect our information together and we try to push the agenda to the particular government body to respond to it in a humane manner. but I don't actually have a single answer to like specific strategy or solution to that question of yours.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded a little bit of Nora's presentation yesterday when she talked about ontological agnopolitics, I think, which and epistemological as well, and institutionalized hypocrisy. These terms kind of still ringing in my ear. Linda, thank you very much. That was super insightful and a great way to bring us towards the end of our meeting here. We still have a couple of sessions left following this, but that was incredibly invigorating. So a warm round of applause for Linda. Thank you very much. Yeah, we have two more bits left in our program. The next one is launching the GAPS edited volume and data repository, and that's going to be followed by, and stick around for this too, a video that captures a lot of the things we've been talking about the past couple of days. Migration Matters has been a part of the GAPS project, accompanied it from the beginning, and we'll be showing a film about return migration that captures very much the experience. So yeah, let me turn the floor over to my wonderful colleagues for this next